Worldwide, almost 20% of all trafficking victims are children. However, in some parts of Africa and the Mekong region, children are the majority. In parts of West Africa, they are close to 100% of known trafficking victims in the region. Children around the world are finding themselves being trafficked, mainly because they were vulnerable. A UN report noted that there were 115 million kids worldwide not in school, and disproportionately, there were girls, with 70% being female. Not being in school is one form of vulnerability, but poverty, abuse at home, sexual assault, living in conflict zones, and more make kids vulnerable to predators. As of 2017, there were 420 million children living in conflict zones. These are zones where there are active combats taking place. Beyond exposing kids to violence, there is risk of young boys being forced into combat as soldiers, and this is a form of human trafficking. Whether kids are trafficked to be soldiers, or sex trafficking victims, or forced to labor on a coffee plantation for up to 10 hours a day, the reality is that traffickers are driven by profit. According to Sidith Kara, there are more than a million young women and children who have been deceived, abducted, seduced, or sold by their own families in some cases to be sex trafficked across the globe. After traveling to many countries and documenting cases of sex trafficking firsthand, Kara found that only 4.2% of the world's slaves are trafficked for sex, but they generate nearly 40% of the profits for traffickers. Individuals who traffic children for labor are also interested in profit, as for most businesses, the largest operating cost is labor. So acquiring a child to work for free helps to keep costs down in the cruelest way possible. In the United States in 2019, children made up nearly 25% of all identified human trafficking victims. And while that number might be startling to you, it may actually be much worse because in 2019, the National Human Trafficking Hotline identified just over 22,000 people, but they were only able to confirm the ages of about 7,000. That means that there were more than 15,000 victims that we do not know the ages of. It seems highly likely that there are thousands more kids within that 15,000 that were victims. Kids in the US can find themselves being trafficked in a number of ways, but the number one way is through coercion. The more vulnerable and isolated a child is, the easier it is to coerce them. Runaways can be easy targets for traffickers, and according to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, of the more than 23,500 endangered runaways reported in 2018, 1 in 7 were likely victims of child sex trafficking. So saying that child sex trafficking is a big deal in the US is not an overstatement. The standard price for sex at a brothel in the US is $30. Trafficked children can see 25 to 48 customers a day. They work up to 12 hours a day, every day of the week, every year, and the traffickers earn between $150,000 and $200,000 per child. There are examples of large sex trafficking rings operating in the US, like the Cadena family, that trafficked more than 1,000 girls and young women from Veracruz, Mexico, into the US, and then forced them into prostitution. And upon being caught, the ringleader of the 16-member trafficking group admitted that some of the girls were as young as 14. While cases like the Carina family are horrific and catch media attention, the truth is that many kids will be recruited into trafficking by an intimate partner or a family member. And kidnappings are absolutely possible in the US, and they do occur, but keeping our kids safe requires us to be vigilant over those our children are hanging out with on a daily basis. This is true for online interactions as well. In the US, 90% of kids between the ages of 13 to 17 have access to social media sites, with 45% using the internet on a daily basis. Sex trafficking is a horrific reality in the 21st century United States, but kids are being trafficked in other ways as well. According to Polaris, teens are being forced to go door to door selling fraudulent products, including magazine subscriptions. The kids sell from morning until night and are unable to leave due to fraud, manipulation, and coercion. Youth are also being forced to beg for change on street corners and sell baked goods or candy to get donations for fraudulent causes. These are all various types of labor trafficking, and they are very real in the US and involve United States citizens as victims. Another way labor trafficking takes place in the US is by exploiting children who are in the country either with visas or illegally. Trillium Farms is a large egg company that has farms in several states. This farm was found to have multiple youth working in forced conditions and threatened into working for more than 10 hours a day. The youth were only rescued because one escaped and called an uncle who lived in another state and was able to contact the police to help rescue the boys. In either case, labor or sex trafficking, America's kids are at risk, and there is much work that needs to be done to improve our industries and our capability for identifying these young victims. Moving to Africa, we find a continent that has been ravaged by slavery for thousands of years. It has been estimated that during medieval times, between 30 to 60% of Africa's entire population was enslaved. During the hundreds of years that the Atlantic slave trade existed, around 1 million of the 12 million slaves sent across the Atlantic on ships died. In today's Africa, child trafficking is a problem over the entire continent, but some areas are worse than others. In the Ivory Coast, up to 5% of the world's cocoa beans are picked by the hands of children working as labor trafficking victims. In West Africa, girls are trafficked more than any other group, but they are not trafficked for sex like they would be in the US. Instead, they are trafficked as labor trafficking victims. These girls are typically forced into domestic service in homes and restaurants. In North Africa and the Middle East, minors only make up 16% of known victims. Additionally, most of the minors in this region are boys, and the most common types of trafficking include forced begging and organ removal, along with sexual exploitation. Looking over the entirety of Africa, the problems with child trafficking remain diverse, with 19,000 child soldiers still fighting in South Sudan as late as 2018. In Malawi, the paramount chief of the central region, who has informal authority over 900,000 people, continuously fights against child marriages. To date, she has stopped or dissolved more than 2,600 child marriages. At the same time, kids are mining for cobalt to be used in our batteries and electronics. Even on Africa's biggest island, Madagascar, children are being forced to gather mica to be used in electronics for thermal insulation. With a population of more than a billion people, it seems like a no-brainer that some level of child trafficking would exist. But the number of children being trafficked in India is startling. In India, more than 10 million children between the ages of 5 to 14 are forced into human trafficking. Let us briefly look at why this is happening. First, 850 million people a day in India get by on $2 a day or less. This makes them very vulnerable to traffickers promising opportunity. Also, this is almost 80% of the entire country that is at an increased vulnerability. This is essentially making India's children easier for traffickers to coerce, acquire, and if necessary, replace. With so much poverty, even parents are participating in the trafficking of their own children. During his research, Siddharth Kara found a minor who was sold by her parents for less than $500 into sex trafficking. When the girl refused to sleep with the men, the trafficker broke her arm. Beyond poverty, children must also be leery of police in India. By interviewing two victims from a brothel in India, Carl learned that the police went to the brothel every day to collect bribes. And in some cases, they were even given bribes during raids to leave the minors behind and only rescue adults. This corrupt behavior is not unique to India. In the US, in Chicago, Illinois, researchers found that 2% of all sex acts that prostitutes had were with police officers to keep themselves from being fined, locked up, or harassed by the officers. Girls from Nepal who are trafficked into India suffer because they are thousands of miles away and unable to speak the language fully. In these cases, the police will take the girls out of the brothels. But they are not rescuing them. They are holding them for ransom so the brothel owner slash traffickers will pay for their release and force them back into sex trafficking. India also has a vast network of ways that minors are trafficked for the purpose of labor. Oppressed members of India's lower castes find themselves working in one of more than 60,000 brick kilns dotted across India. There are also kids who are trafficked from rural areas of India to work as domestic servants in the homes of people living in cities. Between 2011 and 2013, more than 10,000 kids went missing from a single state within India, and it is believed they were all trafficking victims. Looking at the rest of Asia, we find victims coming from a range of places and trafficked in the most diverse range of ways compared to any other region on the planet. In Bangladesh, there are more than 900,000 Rohingya refugees who live in crowded, sprawling settlements after fleeing Myanmar's violent ethnic cleansing campaign in 2017. Many of the children are disappearing from the camps, and it is believed that the disappearances are linked to human trafficking, at least according to UNICEF. Youth in Asia can also be forced onto one of the region's many shrimping boats. In Bangladesh, during March and April, there are more than 200,000 boats, with 70% of them having minors aboard. Children can also find themselves in the tea fields picking one leaf at a time. The tea industry is so tainted that conservative estimates put 35 to 40% of the industry involving bonded, forced, or child labor. In other parts of Asia, sex trafficking almost seems permissible, as 50-year-old white European men walk hand in hand with teenage Thai girls in Thailand. The girls coerced into sex trafficking in Thailand are being sold for as little as $3 for half an hour of illegal sex with a minor. This is what makes the country such a destination, though, for foreigners to come and prey upon Thailand's youth. Interestingly, women and girls who originate from Nigeria and find themselves forced into prostitution in Thailand are seen as exotic and drive a higher price. These same women in Italy would be considered the least desirable and be much cheaper than other ethnicities. Around the world, child trafficking affects every country and exists in at least 100 countries. The key component to trafficking a child is almost always vulnerability. In 2015, the UN reported that more than 95,000 unaccompanied minors claimed asylum in Europe. By January of 2016, at least 10,000 of those kids were lost and unaccounted for. And the International Organization for Migration stated that as many as 92% of all minors who arrived in Italy during the first half of 2016 were on their own. Throughout Africa and parts of South America, kids are forced to gather cocoa and coffee. It seems everywhere we look, we see kids being trafficked. But what can we do about it? We can do plenty. We can share information like this video with others so they can be aware what is happening and how it's happening. We can make choices right now that fight against labor trafficking. By buying food, clothing, and other items labeled as fair trade, you will be putting your money towards items that are certified by a third party to be free of exploitative workforces, and therefore not have any children being forced to produce your products. If you are unfamiliar with fair trade, I have already made a video detailing what it is and how to identify the products. You can watch using the link above. To fight child sex trafficking, you can connect with a local nonprofit and participate in an outreach program that directly has you meeting with the girls on the streets. Importantly, you can talk to the men in your life about child sex trafficking because 6 to 9% of the world's men purchase sex at some point in their life. The easiest thing to do is to enter the National Human Trafficking Hotline number into your phone so you can report suspicious activity. You can also text "Be Free" and anonymously submit tips. Lastly, if none of that sounds appealing, you can get the book Refuse to Do Nothing and be inspired by the author's amazing will to effect change as she converted herself from a literal soccer mom and into an abolitionist fighting to save human trafficking victims. That is all for this week's episode. I know I didn't mention every country or even every continent, so if there is a country you would like me to cover in a future episode, make sure you leave a comment and tell me what you would like to see. Also, feel free to share what you know about child trafficking from where you live. Lastly, make sure if you are not yet, click the subscribe button because there are new episodes every Monday and Wednesday. Thanks for watching.